welcome back everybody. In this video we're making eyelet lace doilies, very elaborate. You might ask, why would you want one of these? Well, I often use these as doilies underneath my 3D wedding cake cookies, which we'll talk about in a subsequent video. And I use versions of these that have holes in the center for putting together my 3D wedding bouquet. It'll be like the doily underliner underneath this beautiful bouquet of royal icing flowers. But this is a pretty time-consuming little project, as elaborate as it is, so I wanted to dedicate a whole separate video to it. Now, what will you need? You will need to start with a fluted round cookie of any size shape, really. My largest one here is about 6 inches in diameter. I got these gorgeous copper cutters from coppergifts.com, and the smaller one that I'll be working on today is about 4 to 5 inches in diameter, so you can get them in various sizes. Now, the first step is actually marking off your pattern, and let me talk about the smaller one because that's where I'm headed. I want to mark off sort of some guidelines, and then we're going to outline the basic pattern. So I've got one smaller one that's already been marked off and outlined, and you can do any number of patterns, but for eyelet lace, typically there's an opening in the lace and there's some other little string work in that lace. So that's what I'm trying to replicate here, just simple loopy patterns. But to make it look perfectly symmetrical, people often ask me, gee, how do you get it to look so perfectly symmetrical? Well, one thing is I start with these fluted cutters, and they're perfectly symmetrical to start. I can use the little guide loops, the little loops on the edge, as a guide for piping. Otherwise, I just mark off some simple guide marks. So I'm going to have one interior circle here that I want to mark off, and to do that I just take a cookie cutter. This one happens to be 2.5 inches wide, and I'm going to score. I already did it, but just to show you what I did, I centered it. This one has a hole in the middle because it's going to go underneath a wedding bouquet, and I'm going to be mounting a stick through that hole. You can score the line and then just brush off the extra crumbs so it doesn't get in the way. Or if you feel like that's not visible enough, you can always use an edible marker and mark it. Since I'm piping with white, I'm going to avoid the edible marker just because I don't want it to bleed through the white, but I just marked the side of it so you can see kind of how that looks. Okay, so the first step is then outlining. This is basically an extension of outlining and flooding, nothing more complicated than that. And for outlining, I like to use a relatively thick icing. For each cup of my royal icing glue, I usually add about a 1/2 teaspoon to 3/4 teaspoons of water. And what I'm going to do is start by outlining the border like here, and then we're going to go ahead and flood those areas. I find for these loopy patterns, if your icing is too thick, it doesn't want to go in a rounded shape. So sometimes I tend towards a looser outlining icing than I might normally. Just going to go all the way around, kind of letting the icing fall and then rotating the cookie as I need to. Now you might wonder why I chose that particular size opening here. I just wanted to leave enough room for big loops. They're going to fall off this round here. Now let's do the round. I'm going pretty slowly because I'm trying to trace that circle. Sometimes I'll rotate the cookie here so I can see where my icing is falling. It's hard to see it falling as my hand gets in the way. I think that's round enough. Okay, now my loops. Here's what I mean by using the edge of the cookie as a guide. Now I'm going to try to pipe a loop off the center, off the edge of this inner ring, down towards the center of each loop, and I'll use that as my visual guide. I'm going to try to make them all about that big and go all the way around. I mean, you could mark off the end point of this loop, you know, where you want it to stop down here if you wanted. You can measure all the way around, but that just takes an extra step, and I don't think we really need it here. So I'm just going to keep going all the way around. If I don't like how a loop looks, I think that one's a little short, I'll wait for it to set up a little bit, and I can come back in with my trussing needle and pick it up and then repipe the outline. It's a little unrounded on the end, and I might just fix that one so it's a little more perfect. but we'll let it dry a little bit. That way it's it's more easy to just pop it right off without smearing the icing. Any high points that are sticking up, like right here, you might knock them down. We're going to be putting some beadwork on these as details later, and sometimes those little peaks can get in the way. It's important to get that circle in the middle centered so that the pattern around it is symmetric. If it's off a little bit, even a little bit, then some areas the loops are going to be slightly bigger. You're going to have less room for the loops than in other areas. And since this is going to be a bouquet, there's going to be a bouquet of flowers on top of this one. I'm not going to put too much detail in the center because it's going to be covered later. But what I am going to do is put another little set of loops coming off the inside of this circle. And I'm going to use the previous loops that I piped as the guide for those. If they were symmetrical, then this will be pretty symmetrical. I'm making them pretty big because I want to put some little lattice work, sort of those cross stitching, if you will, that you see on eyelet lace, in the middle of them in a later step. And I'm always rotating it just so that I'm overhead and looking at it square on. I find that if my body is at an angle to what I'm piping, everything shifts a little bit to become slanted. Okie dokie, so it's totally outlined. And now we want to flood the entire thing. And by flooding, I mean filling the interiors of those spaces with a looser icing, usually a few teaspoons of water to every cup of icing glue. Now the key thing here in flooding this particular cookie to note is that I'm flooding very small spaces, and those particular spaces that are small are very prone to cratering, and by cratering I mean the icing sinking as it dries. And you'll see that that happened a little bit on this cookie that I did earlier. You see how there's some sunken areas here as opposed to the edge being nice and poofy like on this cookie here. The edge is nice and poofy, no sunken parts. Well, the difference is, I know those areas are prone to cratering. The difference is I treated that cookie differently than I did that cookie. For this cookie, I used a relatively thicker flood. This one was probably slightly looser. And I also got that one in a dehydrator to quick set the icing almost immediately after I had piped it. And that tends to keep it from sinking and keeps it nice and poofy. So if you want to avoid that kind of cratering effect, you want to fill this as quickly as possible and then stick it in a dehydrator. You can use the heat gun too, but that's more tedious. So we're going to use the dehydrator today. I've got it sitting right back beyond me. And I'm only going to flood a section at a time. So I'm not going to flood the entire cookie. I'm just going to flood the outer ring and then the inner ring. Because if I wait too long, if it takes too long to flood, the icing can sink in the process of me flooding it because I haven't gotten into the dehydrator soon enough. So here I am depositing this with a pastry cone to get into these tiny areas. And I'm kind of pushing the icing down as well to make sure there are no air gaps underneath it. That also, I think, to some extent helps with cratering. Though I'm not sure. That could be a wives' tale. But one thing that's important to note is so that I don't get a seam in the icing, because this is a lot to flood very carefully, I want to flood a little bit to one direction, and then I want to go back to the area where I started and start flooding in that area, because if I wait too long, that area will set up and I'll get a seam there. So I'm going to do one more loop, and then I'm going to come back in. See how nice and puffy it is now? And if I get this into the dehydrator fast enough, it should stay that way, knock on wood. The icing is sometimes finicky. Okay, so right about now, I want to rotate and come back and connect with this area, because the icing's still wet enough I can flood there seamlessly without there being a mark. And in some cases I'm not pushing, like in those tiny areas in between loops, I'm not pushing a lot of icing, and I'm just, I'm not applying pressure from the cone, I'm just scooching it around with the tip of the cone because I don't want to overflow the outlines. Now as far as putting it in the dehydrator, I just want to quick set the outside of the icing, the outer shell of the icing, so it doesn't sink back on itself. So I'm only going to leave it in there 5–10 minutes. It depends on how much icing I'm trying to dry. But I don't want to dry I don't need to dry the icing all the way through, and I don't want to because that can dry out the cookie. So I will set my dehydrator on the lowest setting. It's important to have a variable speed dehydrator. That's 95 degrees Fahrenheit, because if it's any hotter than that, the icing can puff up, over puff, and crack, and we don't want that either. Just fits. And back, it's out of the dehydrator. The other advantage, so here's the cookie that's been dehydrated, and here was the one that wasn't. And so you'll see that I don't have any of the depressions that I had, any of the sinkage that I have here. I don't see it here. It's all nice and poofy, and that's because I quick set the outside. The other advantage is it also dries the cookie with a little bit of a sheen. It dries with less of a matte finish. I might do a quick little outline around this hole in the center because I don't want to flood into that. For any doilies that I mount on sticks, I like to leave that clear. And I mount them on sticks for my bridal bouquet. Sometimes. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so there's a really tight corner here. There's just a nuance to the flooding here that I didn't have on the other piece. There's a really tight corner here, and I'll take my trussing needle because the tip of my cone is too big and kind of work the icing in there if I need to. Also, the trussing needle's handy for popping air bubbles. I see one here on the outer edge that I should have popped before it went in the dehydrator. If I pop that now, I'll leave there'll be a big hole there. So you want to pop air bubbles before you dehydrate, if you see any. Pushing the icing through a cone like this helps to push some of the stray air bubbles out of the icing though, so I don't have too much in this icing. Okay, before I go all the way around, I want to make sure I'm knocking the icing into these little corners before it sets up, so I don't have little holes there. Okay, and I would, once I'm done with this, I would stick this in the dehydrator again just to make sure that the center area stays nice and puffy. It is more open, it's less crowded with small openings, so it's more likely to stay puffy without dehydrating, but just in case. It's really only those small angular areas that are really prone to cratering, rather. Okay, that would go in the dehydrator, but we're going to go ahead and move ahead with the rest of the detailing. So, a normal eyelet lace, there are these openings, but there are also these fine little cross stitches that often fill the openings. So I'm going to just try to replicate that, what I've done here on this pink doily, the one with the pink dots on this cookie here, by putting in some of the details in the loops that we've got piped. And then I'll come back and finish it out, probably with brown edging. I think the brown shows up a little bit better than the pink, brown dots. Now, for the tiny little lines, those are like hair thin lines, actually. I use an icing of outlining consistency again, maybe a little bit on the looser side, just to show you what that looks like. It plops off a spoon, and that's that 1/2 teaspoon to 3/4 teaspoon water for every cup of glue. I cover it back up because it dries out really quickly. And I've got that in a parchment cone. I like to work with a parchment cone here because sometimes I don't even have to cut an opening in it, and I can get just the size I need. So my icings shouldn't, because it's a little looser than usual for outlining it, I don't have to apply too much pressure to get it out of that tiny hole. If your hand's really hurting, then you might want to thin the icing a little bit. So for the pattern and the big loops, I just draw one line down, I anchor the icing, and let it fall and touch the other edge. I'm going to be ultra careful with this cookie because my icing, even though it's been dehydrated, is not dry all the way through. So I don't want to press down too hard on it. So I've got those hair thin lines, and then I just did a little cross right across the center of it. If I overshoot and get onto the edge of the doily, again, I like to let the icing dry completely before I put the detail work on. I can scrape it off carefully. So I'm going to do a couple more of those to give you an idea of what I did. And then I'll just complete the beadwork detailing. I'm not going to go all the way around this cookie because this could take me quite some time. If you see your icing doing what that just did, mistake, it broke right in the middle. This is hard to clean up. I'm going to let that dry and I'll come and scoop it out with my trussing needle and start all over. My icing is also curling a little bit at the end, which probably means I need to open up the tip a teeny bit more It shouldn't do that quite so much. It's a little better. Now it's a lot thicker though, the line, but I think that'll work. So one straight line and then across. I'll do a few more of these. For these smaller openings, all I did was simply put a single line through the center. Here I have to be super careful because my center is not at all dry. Let me just show you how I would correct an error like this. I do like it to give it a little bit of time to dry because you see how it just kind of then flakes off without smearing everywhere. It's a much easier cleanup job. And if I have a little brush, I could get all that out. I have a big brush. Let's see if that works. Be really careful with it. So I'm just going to finish off half the doily because I think you have the general idea of how this works. And then I'll go ahead and show you how I finish off the edges with dot work. Just one more cross here. And just as, again, as a word of caution, it's best to wait, make sure that the icing is completely dry. This was just dehydrated to crust the top before you do this detail work because I applied a little too much pressure here and took a little bit of the icing out because it's still soft underneath with 5 minutes in the dehydrator. Okay, so I'm going to detail with some little teeny brown dots. Let me just show you an example. So around each little loop, teeny brown dots, and then some bigger dots as accents once I get the little ones down. And then we might do some tiny little white dots around the outer edge. So for that I have icing of beadwork consistency, which for each cup of my icing glue I have about 2 to 3 teaspoons of water in it. And again, this was in the bag for a little while so the tip dried shut, but I've just forced the icing out, testing on my work surface first. And it's forming a nice little dot on its own. I'm applying no pressure here. I'm just going to go all the way around the edge. I'll do a couple of these just so you get the gist of it. Really applying hardly any pressure to get these teeny tiny dots. And I've got a barely perceptible hole cut in the tip. I did them around these little areas as well. The icing up here is still wet because I didn't dehydrate this, so I'll have to be super careful. I just think this helps to conceal any of the ends of the white lines that I piped earlier, because I'm actually piping these little dots right on top of them to hide them. It just kind of accentuates the loop a little bit more. You can see you want to set aside some time for this project because this kind of detail work is just time consuming. This little doily here, this 4 or 5 inch one, might take me half an hour to 45 minutes to do from start to finish. And the bigger one obviously a little bit longer. Okay, now I would complete all the little dots first, then come back, open up the tip a little bit so I can get bigger dots in some of these other accent points. So I put big dots here, again, to kind of conceal these joints. I like to put dots to conceal problem areas, but where lines come together and connect, that's a good place for a dot. I'm also going to put some down here. And then lastly, I'd come in with icing of beadwork, white icing of beadwork consistency in a cone with very, very small opening to do the tiny little dots on the very outer edge. So I'm just transferring that icing I used to flood before, which is basically the right consistency, into another cone that has a very tiny opening, testing it. It's working well. I come down here and apply dots to this edge. I'm kind of working from the side here. and hanging it off the edge of the icing to conceal the outline that I piped earlier. And also when you view this doily from the top, it just kind of creates the sense of a little bit of a lacy edge. So I would continue in that vein. First, all the little brown dots, let them dry, then the dark brown dots, and then come back in with the white dots, and then you'll end up with something that looks like this. Before we cut and go to the next video, I did want to talk a little bit about how I extended that smaller pattern onto this larger cookie. This is the 6-inch round. It's simple. No matter, it's really as simple as just creating another layer. So I had a smaller guide in the middle and a larger guide traced on the outside. I did the exact same pattern on this outer rim, but then I did some interior loops in that middle ring, and then I did some other loops on the very inside ring. So you can get as elaborate as you want. I got a little more elaborate on this one because I'm going to be putting a 3D wedding cake on it, so more of it will be exposed. On this one with the hole, there'll be a whole arrangement in the middle, so there's no reason to do the center. So anyway, beautiful cookies on their own, beautiful underneath a wedding bouquet, or beautiful underneath the 3D wedding cake in future videos. Till then, live sweetly.